Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar on third-party costs. My name's Ian Barnard. I'm the Senior Cost and Development Analyst here at E.ON UK Retail. The Cost and Development team, we handle most of the third-party costs you can see in this presentation. Personally, I specialise in Chenios and feed-in tariffs, so I might waffle on a bit more about those, but I'll try and keep it balanced. I'm going to give you a breakdown on how the third-party costs outturned in 2017 compared to what we said, and then give a bit of detail on the changing landscape and what drivers we've got and what's changing the forecast and what's causing uncertainty going forward. And I'll give a few examples a bit later on what's keeping us up at night. But let's start with where we finished last time round. 2016. When we delivered this presentation, two key messages. The first, costs were expected to continue rising. I don't think that surprised anybody. And the second one, the changing use of our networks infrastructure was leading to significant market reform. And as we go forward in the presentation, I think you'll find that was very much correct. How did the costs outturn? I'll talk about this slide or the chart in a bit more detail. This is an indicative example customer. We've used East Midlands here. They're fairly central. Obviously, some of these costs are regional, duos and chenios. So this picture would vary depending where you were in the country. It's just going to be the size of the boxes will change a bit. It's fairly indicative countrywide. It's a 1 gigawatt hour customer, LV meter, half-hourly LV meter. The y-axis is pounds. So you'll see in 2015. This example customer was paying roughly £95,000 for this cost stack, and then that's increased fairly significantly 16 and then a bit more in 17. I should have mentioned this cost stack, we've included wholesale costs, then raw energy costs. Now that's not something we're going to delve into in this topic, that's not something we deal with, but it's interesting. I think it gives you a better reflection of the overall cost stack. And I think it also reflects, quite interestingly, how third-party costs have changed. If you look at 2015, it was roughly 50%. Now, I've been doing this for a few years now, and we were used to quoting the wholesale cost of being roughly 60% of the overall bill, and you see it's becoming sort of even with third-party costs until 2017, when you notice the wholesale market has come off a little bit, but despite that, the overall stack has gone up, and this is because of the ever-increasing third-party costs. I think that's an interesting picture. We may see that going forward, but obviously the wholesale market can and does change with the weather, so who knows how that's going to outturn in future years, but certainly for the short term, we expect that picture to continue. Let's go into a bit more detail about the individual costs then. We'll start with Chenios, one of mine, up 7% year on year, and that's pretty much in line with expectations. The 7% is kind of made up of two different elements, the main one being that National Grid don't just collect revenue on behalf of their own network. They're sort of a cash collector, and they collect revenue on behalf of all of the offshore networks, the OFTOs, and also the two Scottish TOs. And most of that 7% is made up of other people's revenue, not just National Grid's. And then part of that will be down to the generation demand splits. If you're familiar with how National Grid collect their revenue, you'll know that it's split between generators and demand, G&D demand being suppliers, we get the bills. Historically, the GD split was always 73%, but that changed a couple of years ago. This is because the generators, the amount you're allowed to charge a generator is capped. It's an EU regulation, which is interesting in itself. But the generators aren't allowed to pay more than €2.50 per megawatt hour on average. As the Chenios cost has gone up, or as National Grid's allowed revenue has increased, we've become closer and closer to breaching that €2.50, and so they've had to change the split. And currently, the supply side, the demand side, is paying over 80% of the charge. In many ways, it's kind of net zero because the generators don't pay out the kindness of their heart. So anything they pay Chenios-wise, that's going to appear in your wholesale market. So if the demand side goes up, your Chenios goes up, you should see a bit come off theoretically in the wholesale market. Obviously, that can get wiped out in an oil spike, so it's very hard to quantify, but that's the science. But I just deal with the demand Chenios. And so I see that increasing as the generator side comes off. But like I say, 7% in line with expectations. Duos, Duos, we get 15 months notification period. So when we spoke to you about Duos last year, we already knew what 17 was. We already got the 17 actuals from the DNOs, network operators. So this is 18 we're talking about here, although it's not the chart. So 18 was up 3%, and that's not massive. It's a big cost, but that's not a huge increase. It's, you could write that off to RPI. Saying that, within that 3%, there's an awful lot of noise. There were some pretty major industry changes to Duos costs in 2018. If you're a half-hourly customer, you'll be familiar with the RAG setup for the Duos, the red, amber, green rates. That's changed quite a lot. There was a modification, DCP 228, which I won't go into too much detail, but if you'd like to hear more about it, get in touch with us. We can produce some quite detailed analysis on it. It's interesting if you've load shifted in particular. So it's a 3% increase year on year, but within that, there's an awful lot going on. SUOS. Actually, I'll talk about the asterisks. We've got the SUOS and feed-in tariff. You see the single asterisk, latest best view, LBVs. That's because you don't know the outturn of the SUOS or the feed-in tariff until after the fact. So I can't tell you what the actuals are going to be. We don't know yet. Both highly weather dependent. So tricky ones to forecast. But SUOS up 31%. I'll go into a lot more detail on that at a later slide, but that was above expectations. Feed-in tariff, less so, 19%, still fairly large increase. One of the smaller costs still, and you'd expect that to settle down a bit. There were some fairly large cuts to the amount the feed-in tariff generators get paid for generating, certainly for new builds, and that slowed down the growth in feed-in tariff quite considerably. So you would expect that to settle down, but of course FIT is always liable to weather. So if we ever get a good summer, then that could cause a significant spike in FIT costs. But 17. As far as we can tell, the summer was pretty weather normal. It's looking fairly average, and the 19% was in line with expectations. RO, complete coincidence, it's 19%, not connected to FIT, albeit similar technologies. That was above expectations, and again, I'll go into some more detail on that in the following slide. Following to CFD and CNDMR charges. Huge percentage increases, terrifying numbers, but starting from a very low point, you can barely see them on the chart for 2016, and they appear in 17. But these are definitely costs to be keeping an eye on going forward. They've effectively replaced RO, like we say, closed to new entrants. So any new generators are liable to sign up for CFD or CN, so we will expect to see those grow, hopefully not by 500 and 1300% in future years, but you would expect to see them grow significantly. Excuse me. So that's outturn. Were there any surprises? Well, I kind of ruined the surprise by telling you that we got some. The SUOS, the capacity auctions, and RO all outturned slightly differently from where we were expecting. Start with the SUOS, balancing services use system. This is the charge handled by National Grid as well, and it's all about balancing supply. Supply and demand, balancing it all in real time. It's been tricky to forecast, becoming more so in recent years. The SUOS, because it's dealing with real-time generation, and we've got a lot more intermittent generation, we've got a lot more wind farms, then of course that becomes harder to forecast and slightly harder to manage. That's fairly well established. That isn't what caused the surprise this time around. It was the black start contracts. You may have heard of black start, but these are generators who can re-energize, in the event of a blackout, they can re-energize the generators without the need to draw on power from the network. So they're kind of key in the event of a major blackout to getting everything back up and running. Once the black start generators are going, then everybody else can join in. There's already an element of that in the SUOS. We've got somewhere between 20 and 30 million pounds per annum included. Last year, there were two new contracts negotiated, National Grid, with two major generators, Fiddler's Ferry and Drax. And the new contracts come in at £113 million. So then that's over and above the 20 to 30 that's already in there, so pretty significant. Often said you can't have all that, but you can have £95 million. So that's a pretty significant increase. I don't think anybody was expecting it to be that large. I think anyone in the industry was expecting that. And so that causes the I think it was a 31% rise in Brazil, that's the majority of that. Capacity auctions, on the other hand, are slightly lower than expected. Despite those huge percentage increases I showed, outturned slightly lower. There was the January auction for about 54 gigawatts of capacity coming in October. We expected that to outturn somewhere between 25 35 kilowatts, a fairly wide range. Actually outturned at just £6.95. That got everyone by surprise. We think that was down to generators bidding particularly aggressively. They think that they're going to get their slice of the cake, and also the wholesale market. Though I was talking about it come off in 17 when the auction happened, was a bit higher, and the higher the wholesale market, it gives the generators a bit more leeway. They don't need quite so much to come in the additional revenue from the capacity market, which meant they could come in a bit lower. So the slight reduction there, and that offset some of the increases we've seen elsewhere, like source and the RO. The RO is a complicated one. Our forecast of the renewable obligation doesn't necessarily try to match exactly what renewables generation would create, the amount of ROCs actually produced. What we're trying to match is what BEIS think is going to happen. RO forecast is a forecast of a forecast. Because what BEIS says goes on this one. And BEIS have produced their forecast for 17. There was an interesting addition to that. They've revised some of their load factors, particularly for onshore wind generation, and they've ramped their load factors right up. And their argument is perhaps sound. They're saying that new technology is more efficient, then for the load factor is going to increase, your new wind farms are going to be generating a lot more than your old wind farms. And that's perhaps sound, but it's much bigger numbers than we were expecting. So if you're generating more ROCs, that means the supplier obligation is larger. That means your RO rate is going to increase to rather simplify the renewables obligation. So it was those new load factors that caught us by surprise. Be interesting to see how that pans out going forward, whether they were accurate and exactly what they're going to include for following years. And we should get an idea on 18 in the next couple of months. So that's the surprises. Let's talk about changes of volatility, or sources of volatility, and how they're changing. It says here conventional charges stabilise, and that's true to some respect. Certainly the revenue, the allowed revenue, we've got a fairly good grasp on. We get some really good data from National Grid and the DNOs, and the LDZ charges as well, that they're fairly stable. You get a lot of noise within the rates, but it's kind of shuffling money around, and the established projects are fairly well known. The tricky ones are the ones we've talked about, the EMR stuff, because they're market-led. So if you link to the wholesale price in any way, if that's going to affect the third-party charge, there's nothing more volatile than the wholesale price. You've got so many factors in there, weather, oil, I mean, key ones. So they're going to have an impact on the third-party costs, and it makes them quite tricky to forecast. So we're going to have to keep tabs on those going forward. And then the third point is one I'm seeing a lot of in my cost policy, regime change, certainly hard to predict, and the amount of changes out there at the moment is unbelievable. And then delays in decision making. There's one thing saying, yes, this is going to happen, but when is it going to happen? We're always getting delays. You've got to start pricing the changing at some point. But when, do you believe BEIS or Ofgem when they say it's going to be this month, and when actually outturns a year later? And we've got a really good example of that coming up. So that's source of volatility, changing landscapes. So what's next? Well, I'll give you some examples of where we're seeing some changes. We've got one massive change we've got coming up. And it just highlights how the energy world is changing slightly. Let's start with Project Nexus. It's up and running now. It was delayed. Talking about delays previously, it was delayed massively. As of June, Project Nexus was all up and running. I don't think this has a significant impact on the final end user. The gas team might not thank me for saying that, but this is very much to do with the processes. It's billed as the most significant change to gas since privatisation. It's a huge change process-wise. It's all to do with settlements. So ExoServe run the gas settlements, and they've had a big old IT change, and it changes everything to do with settlements. You've got a whole raft of changes to AQs. It's no longer one AQ per annum. You've got separate AQs for transportation. AQs could change throughout the year. It aligns some of the independents, and you've got some new settlement classes coming in. So we do away with DM and NDMs, daily meters, non-daily meters, and you've got sort of 4 new settlement classes. It's a big IT change for Nexus, which is a massive IT change for us and for everybody in the industry. Like I said, I don't think it's going to huge impact on third-party costs, but it's an idea of the ever-changing landscape. This whole project is all about, it's an enabler. It's getting ready for the new world, the rollout of AMR and smart meters, that sort of thing. So it's indicative of the changes we're having to deal with. And talking of changes we're having to deal with. So this one is stable transmission charging review. And that was how it started. I should probably have updated this slide to put in even bigger type strategic code review as well, because this kind of morphed into something much bigger. We'll start with where this started. CHNIOS, sort of close to my heart. If you're a half-hourly customer, you'll be familiar with the triads. It's how National Grid collect the revenue, half-hourly customers. And the big question on the right of the slide, is the current CHNIOS charging methodology fit for purpose? And it's a question that's been raised a lot. And it's all about New World. You've got a lot more decentralized generation, as I say, embedded generation, and you get an awful lot of triad avoidance. Now, on the one hand, I would say that if people are avoiding the triad, that's the triad doing its job, surely. It's all about trying to reduce the need to invest in the infrastructure, and if you're reducing the peaks, then that's working, which is fair enough, but National Grid still need to collect their revenue, and they need to collect everybody else's revenue as well. We've talked about the OFTOs and Scottish TOs. So if everyone's avoiding the triad and you've got embedded generation, they create negative demand, so that reduces the volume at GSP, so reduces triad charges even less. National Grid have to keep putting the rates up because they're not getting the money back from the triad, and this is sort of ever-increasing problem. So this is something which needs to be raised and needs to be looked at. Some of it has been picked up by some recent modifications, CMP 264, 265. You may have seen they're going to come into effect in 2018. It's quite a technical change, but it deals with the embedded generators and actually how they can benefit from helping others avoid the triads. That's quite techy, but it's kind of part of this, but it's also separate because it's already been given the nod. Since this came into play, National Grid have picked it up and ran with it, and they've said that's not enough. We need more than review. We're going to have we need more than a charging review. We need a significant code review. Now, significant code review, an SCR, it's the biggest stick Ofgem have got. The last one started in 2010, ran through to 2015. It's one that maybe didn't have a huge impact to the final end user, but how the CHNIOS charges were calculated, massively different following transmit. And this SCR is going to be even bigger, I think. It's a bit hard to be truly quantitative on it because we haven't got the consultation yet. We're expecting something in a few months. It's important to say it's not just CHNIOS. Now, this is a CHNIOS slide, but the SCR picks up GEOS as well. In particular, it's going to be looking at what they call the residual element. So CHNIOS and GEOS, you have a locational element in the charges. That won't get you back to the revenue that the network operators are trying to get to, so they top it up with the residual. Now, traditionally, and how most people think, residual, oh yeah, that's the little bit left over. That's not the case, it's massive. For CHNIOS, it's pretty much all of the CHNIOS charges. It's all in the residual. Some of your locational elements are negative, so it has to make up all of National Grid's revenue. And this is just getting more and more worse. And is that truly cost reflective? Often hate anything which you can't bill as cost reflective. And so that's going to be looked at in a lot more detail. GEOS, it's not as massive. It's about 50%, I think. They used to call it the scaler in the GEOS. But again, it's all about residual charges, getting you back up to their total allowed revenue, which we said National Grid collect revenue on behalf of other people, so that all forms part of your residual. The DNOs, they have incentives, and not just investment, they're incentivized, and if they hit their targets, then they can increase their revenue, and that, again, forms part of the residual. So is that truly cost effective? Probably not. It's something Ofgem are going to look at in a lot of detail. Can't really stress how important this change is. So if you take one thing away from this presentation, it's SCR. If you think that GEOS and CHNIOS combined, roughly half of all of the third-party costs we're talking here, 25% of that cost stack, it really is a big deal. Who knows what it's going to mean? It's such early days. Like I say, the last SCR ran for 5 years, but there's talk about, do we get rid of triads? Maybe we have 2 triads. Maybe everyone pays a pence per kilowatt hour over the year. All bets are off. It's a really big deal. Slightly less so, but still important. EIIs. Now this is a good one to include because it highlights what we're talking about with timing of policy change. EII has been kicking around for a little while. You're an energy-intensive industry. You've been able to receive compensation for our own feed-in tariff for a while now. The EIIs went to the government and said we can't compete with Europe because we're paying all of the green levies you imposed, and so the compensation scheme was arranged. That was fine. The compensation comes out of central funding, and the government would like to move that out of central funding and kind of put it into the rates, make your energy users pick up the tab effectively. So you move from compensation to exemption. And this has taken forever to sort out. So the consultation to move to exemption started in 2016. Originally they were talking about 2017. Obviously that hasn't happened. They're still receiving compensation. It's just dragged and dragged and dragged. Finally, we've had EU state aid approval for RO, but that's not the be-all and end-all. You can't go live with the exemption until it's read before government, and BEIS need to do their new forecast. So currently, apparently it's on target to come in April 18. So all things being equal, which is rarely the case, April 18, EIIs will be exempt from our own fit. That means everybody else has to pick up the tab, so the our own fit rates will increase slightly to incorporate that. Excuse me. But that may yet drag. So this comes back to what I was talking about the timing. Do we start pricing in April 18? Do we think that's going to happen? Or if there's a delay in BEIS getting the forecast out, then it's going to lag. They say it's going to be 4 months from whenever both things have happened, the reading before Parliament and the forecast. It's tricky, but I guess that's what we get paid for. This has always been about our own fit. FIT didn't get EU state aid approval. We think this has been complicated by the fact that FIT is still a live scheme. You still get a new generator signing up, and it's going to be live until 2019. That's caused a problem with getting state aid approval. So that gives us another problem. Do we think that they're going to push it through somehow and try and keep it all aligned? You'd like to think you keep everything aligned. It's not looking likely, but who knows? So that's mainly what I wanted to talk about. This is the final slide. I think it's a fairly good headline. The only certainty is uncertainty. A lot of change out there. SCR, huge change. I'm going to say the same as my boss did last year. Costs are expected to continue rising. I think that's a safe bet. Who knows the magnitude at this point, but I imagine it's going to be similar increases. Uncertainty, likely to remain high. Definitely, we've just talked about EII, how's that going to pan out? Industry reform, likely to reflect the change in the way we use energy. Well, nearly all of the changes we've talked about would ultimately do about changing energy use. Final point though, opportunity exists. I mean, you need to be flexible. It's a changing world, but we think there's definite opportunity out there, and some of our future webinars will discuss that. So that's presentation. Thank you very much. I hope you found that useful. I didn't gabble on too much about Chinos. Going to answer a few questions. We haven't got, it's a bit artsy, excuse me. Okay, so we've had a question, why is RO continuing to increase when it's been discontinued for new entrants? Will it not be phased out? That's a brilliant question, and that's what I keep asking my boss. We kind of covered that. This time around it was due to the load factors. So you would expect to see it increase slightly each year because the buyout price is indexed, so RPI gets applied to the buyout price. So if nothing else, you'd expect RPI increase to your RO rates. You're quite right that it probably should start to drop off, but that's not going to happen until the generators that are signed up for it close down. So, there's still fairly new technology, so don't expect RO to come off, for 10, 15 years or so yet. It's a valid question, but it was load factors this time round. base saying that the new technology is that much more efficient. So that's pushed it up this time. Right, question. Okay, someone's asked, has the description of who qualifies as EII been released yet? It definitely has. In fact, this week, I think earlier this week, Ofgem published a list of all the current EIIs who are receiving compensation. And as far as we're aware, if you receive compensation, then you will be eligible for exemption. So that is out there if you have a look on the Ofgem site. So the original details of how you qualify, it has to be a certain customer type and your energy usage has to be at a certain level, then you'll qualify. But all the details are on the Ofgem site, or if you want, we can probably dig that out for you and forward it on. That's kind of it, I think. Thank you very much. Like I say, I hope that was useful, and that's me done.